So you'll notice that throughout the class, I've talked a lot about degrading the image or adding imperfections to the image. And that's just because reality is imperfect, right? And that's what makes it beautiful. So, how do we recreate that in Unreal? On a real set, for example, I might want to degrade the image or break up the image by using filters such as ProMIS or glimmer glass or anything like that. I might use vintage lenses that have nice fall off on the edges and swirly bokeh or something like that to just kind of break down the digital image of today's digital cameras. In Unreal, the idea still is the same. We just have to do it a little bit differently since we're not using physical cameras. If we leave the image untreated inside of Unreal, it's just going to look a little bit too clean and a little bit too perfect for that organic cinematic quality that we're after. And so in this module, we're going to be looking at just a few different settings inside the post-process volume that will help dirty up that image and get it closer to real life. So let's take a look at how to do that. You'll notice already here in module 12, if we load that up, we have some stuff going on here in our post-process volume, and we'll look at how to get through all that. So let's load up our sequence. And here we are. I hit G to make stuff go away. And you'll notice that there's some stuff going on in our post-process volume. Like we have some bloom going on with the highlights here. Even the color correction's a little bit different than what we've seen before. But not to worry, we're going to go step by step on how to do that. So I'm going to actually disable this post-process volume, and we're going to recreate another one from scratch. We're going to match this one right here. So in order to do that, I'm going to look up for enable. I'm going to type that in, and I'm going to turn it off. And you'll see that obviously our settings go away. Not to worry, we are going to recreate that right now. So if we go up here to the Place Actors window, we can go ahead and look for post-process volume, and we can drag it in like we did before. And here we have it. Let's drag it into our volumes tab here, or folder, and let's rename it V2. First things first, we need to match our exposure, and I'm going to just go with the settings we had earlier. So under post-process volume V2, we're going to look up exposure, EXP. We're going to go to our manual mode like we did before, and we're going to make our exposure compensation 8.5. Now, why is it dark? Well, we haven't set our infinite extent unbound, so we're going to search unbound, and we're going to tick that on, and all of a sudden we're back to where we were. So this is our naked post-process volume without any effects whatsoever, and it'll come in with the default settings, which is good, so I can walk you through. So here we are. We're back to our exposure levels that we had before. We can even look at, Ziva's camera here, and we'll see that that's exactly where we've been. So I'm going to go back out of the camera here, and we're going to take a look at it like so. So let's go through this post-process volume and some of these settings that we're going to look at for degrading the image. The first one that comes to mind right now is the bloom. And what that does is it adds like a little bit of a glare or a bloom to the highlights in the scene, which is kind of how most cameras would react to a certain degree. So we can go ahead and do that, and that kind of adds that imperfection in this case. So let's go ahead and tick these on, and you'll immediately see not only that we have a flare going on, I'll address that in a second, but our highlights have a certain bloom to them, right? Like a glow to the edges. And that's something that we want. So let's go ahead and tweak that. First things first, I'm going to turn off the flare for now because I don't like working with that when I'm trying to get the bloom down. So I'm going to go scroll down to lens flares, tick on this intensity here, and let's put it at 0. And now we can go back to our bloom tab. If you scroll back up, here it is, bloom. I think these default settings are pretty good, actually, at least for these 3 here. You can mess around with the intensity and really make it more intense, but I recommend the default because it's just kind of a pretty realistic glow. It's not going crazy. And we always want to keep things subtle. We want to break up the image, but we don't want to go too far. It looks a little cartoony. The last thing on the bloom that we can do is we can go under here under the advanced tab and size scale. The default is 4. I like to go maybe to like 10, and that just kind of spreads it out a little bit more. And it's not making it more intense, it's just spreading it out. So if you go to, 50, you'll see that it's spreading it too much. But 10 seems like a good number to me. And I like to do that. These other settings you can play around with. I don't usually typically do. Next up, we can go back to our flare and see what that does. So because those two kind of play hand in hand, that's what I like to do. I was just going between the two until I find something nice. So under lens flares, let's go back to our intensity at 1, and you'll see that we have flares that are coming from pretty much anything that's bright in the scene. And just a little bit too intense and obviously distracting here, and not really hyper realistic. Um, so we're going to try and minimize that and keep things subtle. You'll notice that it does come from pretty much any bright object in the scene, and it really just does come on once you turn on the bloom. If I go back up to our bloom here and I turn it off under intensity, you'll see that the flare goes away with it as well. So those two things go hand in hand. And let's go ahead and go over here to bokeh size. And bokeh is just these, you might have heard me talk about it a few times. Bokeh is just these out of focus elements here. And that's what we're going to be changing the size of real quick. So I think I'm going to go to the max. Well, there's no max. You can type in whatever numbers you want. But if you scroll all the way to the right, you'll hit the number 32. And you'll see that we've made our bokeh elements way bigger, right? And I think that just, we keep the flare in play, but we're not super distracting. It's there only when we see that there's something in front of the lens, but it's not really obvious what it is. You can go half intensity here, to make it even a little more subtle. Let's take a look at our wide shot from back here. You remember our PD walls in front. Let's turn that off. And let's see how that wide flare is feeling. Let's go back to our post-process volume V2 and turn off and on the intensity or the flare. So let's go from 0 to 0.5. And yeah, it's just there. It's nice. We see something. It is moving with our frame. It kind of glows up the image a little bit. And then once we get past those two highlights up here, it goes away. So it feels pretty natural. I like that where it is right there. So let's leave that. And of course, you can go more intense, less intense. It's up to you. I'm going to leave it at 0.5. There's some other stuff under here that you can choose to change, but I'll just like to leave all this at default. Next up, we have image effects. And under here, we have vignette intensity and grain intensity and grain jitter. I don't typically play too much with the vignette. We can add it to like a 0.5. Let me just show you what it does. It's just going to darken the sides of our image, and we can go from 0.4, I believe, is the default. So there's actually no change there. And if we go to 0.5, just add a little something. That feels good to me. I like that there. And then the next one is we have grain jitter and grain intensity. We're actually not going to turn on grain jitter. We're just going to go grain intensity. And you'll see that if we go to 1, it's going to be way too grainy and too obvious. I like to keep it at like 0.1, 0.15 max. So let's go ahead and do that. 0.15. Oops. 0.15 right here. And pretty subtle, obviously, compared to what we just saw, but it's totally there. And I don't know if you guys can see it online, but it's definitely all around the walls here. And it feels pretty organic, pretty natural for just this baked in kind of Unreal Engine grain. Of course, you can add this in post as well. And if you do that, then I would choose to leave the grain off in Unreal and then add it in the post later. But if you want to keep everything in Unreal, this is a great way to kind of break up the image and make it more organic. So we have our grain, we have a vignette, and there's a couple other things here I want to touch on. But before we go into all of that, the next big thing is to add our look back into our shots here. So let's go ahead and go to our LUT. But before we do that, we search for a film. We're going to turn these on. And we're actually not going to go to 0 like we had before. We're going to go to 0.3 on this and 0 here, flattening out our image. And why I'm doing that, and I'll show you in a second, is because I'm just not going to go full intensity on the LUT we created earlier. We're just going to go to like 0.7, 0.8 on it. So I searched for LUT under color grading LUT. We can go ahead into this drop down here and just search for BB or Benjamin Button LUT. and drag that in, you'll see it's way too intense right now. That's because we're kind of using the film options that we had earlier, and we're going to decrease our intensity here. So we have our color grading LUT intensity. We're going to go to like a 0.7. And that's feeling pretty good to me. So let's look at Ziva's close up. And one way to look at all three cameras without always switching is to just go to this camera cuts here. I have it set up for our three shots. And now we can, when it cuts to the other shot, we can just scroll through and quickly kind of preview the look on all three cameras. I'm pressing play here. And yeah, that feels pretty good. We could maybe go to 0.75 just to bring that up a little bit. Contrast as well. And that feels pretty good. So it just goes to show that inside of the post-process volume, you can really tweak your grade and your color correction. So if we go back to our film options here, typed in film, and you play around with the toe, you're going to see that we get a little more or darker in the shadows and higher contrast all around. So between using these numbers, I'm going to go back to 0.3, and the LUT numbers, we can get to a less intense version of what we had earlier. So we have our look back in. It's feeling pretty good. And all of the elements are starting to really come together really nicely. We're breaking up the image. We're kind of like making everything pretty cohesive and cinematic. We have some filmic colors now. We have that kind of Benjamin Button warmth and green warmth or yellow warmth, if you will. And things are feeling pretty good all around. So what I would like to do next is show you that under the post-process volume, we can continue to color correct or grade the image. So we have a couple big options here. We have the temperature and the tint. I'm going to go to like 5,500. I'm just going to cool it down a little bit, take a little bit of that warm edge off the image. And I'm also going to go back to a little bit greener. So if I scroll left, it's going to go greener. If I scroll to the right, it's going to go more magenta. And that's your tint, right? It goes from green to magenta. And then temperature goes from blue. Let me turn this off to demonstrate. It goes from blue to warm. So I'm going to go to 5,500 where I just had it. We just took it off from the 6,500, just cooled it down a little bit right here. And then our tint, I'm going to go to like minus 0.1, just a little hint of green there. And that feels pretty good. You also have the option to continue to grade the image here in Unreal with all of these settings here. You have a ton: saturation, contrast, gamma, gain, offset. And then you have it for each one of the three shadows, midtones, and highlights. So tons of control here. You might want to, I'm just going to demo here, like bring down the overall saturation. So you go to saturation, drop down arrow, and then go to 0.5. And all of a sudden we're in a very desaturated scene. Now you can also do that for just the shadow saturation, which maybe you want to. So you go to shadows, saturation, and let's just say 0.5. And you barely notice it, but let me see if I go to 0 here, you might notice it in the cheek right here, that how the dark shadows are here are starting to get pretty black and white. There's no tint to it. There's no warmth to it. I'm going to go back to 1, watch this, and back to 0, and then back to 1 again. And you'll see just that warmth in the shadows comes back. So tons of control here. I would leave it pretty much as default with the way we've set up our LUT and everything. But just so you know, there's other options to continue grading in the post-process volume. One of the last things I want to show you is also, fog or haze in this case, and how we add that in. Now, you might have already added this earlier in the process, but since it does affect the overall look, I'm going to add it into this section here and see how we can play with that. So let's go ahead and look up exponential under place actors, exponential height fog. Drag that into our scene, and let's drag that under our volumes folder. And you'll see that the fog is just really playing outside right now. We don't want that. I'm going to show you the settings that I like to use so that you can recreate them if you need to. So first things first, we need to make this a volumetric fog because right now it's not. So we're going to scroll down under volumetric fog. We're going to turn that on. Now we're going to make this fog and scattering color. We're going to make that black. And then we're going to make this directional and scattering color black. And that just makes it the color of whatever your scene is, essentially, or your light. If you had a directional light like a sun in the scene, then it would make it um, the color of what the sun color would be. Um, don't ask me too much about that, but basically, I know that what you want to do is just make things black here and black here, and then you're in a pretty good place to start messing with the fog. Now, you'll notice that when we're using the fog, we're affecting kind of the milkiness of the outside, and that's okay. And you'll see that we have a little bit of a fog glow right in that vicinity as well. Now, we can try and bring up our overall fog intensity, but I'll show you what that does. Under fog density, we're going to go to 0.1. And while we get more fog in our scene, we're also kind of affecting our background, which in this case is so critical to our look. So we don't want to do that. But what I'll show you is how we can get this kind of the appearance of fog in the scene without affecting too much of our background in this case. And so we're going to go back to our default settings here. And what we're going to do is we're going to click on this lamp, and you'll see under lamp, we have a point light and a spotlight. We're going to click on our spotlight, and under volumetric scattering intensity, we're going to dial this way up just to kind of pretend that there's fog inside of our scene, or enough fog inside of our scene that it's creating a shaft. So we're going to dial it up to 50, and that's way too much. Let's dial it up to 10 and see how that's playing. Let's see. And that's still maybe a little too distracting, to be honest. Like, yeah, it looks cool, but maybe a little too distracting. Maybe let's keep it at 5, where it's like, it's believable that there's a shaft of light, but it's not over the top there. All right. So that just adds another little element of believability of reality. You know, if we're playing with fog, that's, you know, the same reason we would add fog into a real scene on set is the same reason we add it here. It's just to add a little extra dimension, a little extra depth to the scene. And that's what we're doing with by adding that in. Just make it more cinematic, essentially. So I feel pretty good all around about all these little tweaks we've made on the post-process volume. Let's take a look at how this all looks without the post-process volume so we can see the before and after. So if I go to post-process volume V2 and search enable, we're going to turn it off. And let's scroll to a part where it's in focus here. And off and off and on. And notice the bloom. And of course, our color correction. Now, we did get a little darker, but I think we're in a more cinematic world here now. You know, this belongs more in a, you know, probably a network sitcom show. And then this becomes a part of a Fincher movie, or, you know, something like Benjamin Button, which I guess is a Fincher film. But yeah, so there you go. We have a pretty big radical difference, though we've brought everything together by bringing some flair, some grain, a vignette, some bloom, and some fog, and bringing, of course, our LUT and our color grading all together. And we've had a pretty awesome result here. So back to Zivas now, and on and off, and Trey. So yeah, and there you have it. One last thing I wanted to show you is by going to, we're going to hit our console command, and we're going to hit our tilde key, console command, tone mapper. We're going to search for tone mapper sharpen, and we're going to dial this up to 2. We're just going to sharpen the image a little bit, make it a little bit more high res. Now, I think it's actually a little bit too much here. Let's just go to 1 by hitting up on the arrow key and then going to our most recently used command, and we're going to do 1 instead of 2. And that feels pretty good. And then just to show you the difference by, again, going up on the key, and we're going to go to 0. Look closely at her eye, you know, the highlight in her eye when I hit 0. And you see it's quite a bit blurrier. So we're going to just sharpen that up by hitting tone mapper 1. You want to be really subtle with this, because if you go too crazy, it just doesn't look good. So that was one last thing to kind of bring everything together. And that's feeling pretty good all around. Let's take a look at some of our other cameras really quick. So we have our wide, feels great. Nice close up on Ziva, coming around on her. We have our handheld look playing well, and a nice little tilt down on boom down on Trey. Let's take a look at some of our other cameras that we created, the crane shot and our dolly shot. I wanted to point something out here. So here we are in our crane. You know, a nice little flare coming from that lamp now. Pretty subtle, nothing too crazy. And let's go ahead and hit play on that. And our grade is working really well. We have these kind of nice cyan blues now. That looks pretty nice right there. The warm colors are coming together pretty nicely. And I wanted to point out something here. So if we were shooting from this side, this is now just a on-set tip, if you will. If we were shooting from this side, I probably wouldn't have the lighting that I have on them from camera side right now because it just looks a little too flat. Oh, by the way, let's bring up our wall again. I would probably turn off the lights that are kind of front lighting them right now. So just really quickly demo, I'm going to go to my practical lighting, main lighting actually. Under main lighting, we have our talent lighting, and under kickers, that's what we're going to turn off, and watch just how much better that feels as far as lighting goes. We're just not as frontally lit. It's more of a silhouette. Now, of course, I would do a lot more than this if I was really lighting it, but I just wanted to show you really quickly how the kickers are just making it less interesting, just overly lit and flat to camera. Another way to demo that is if we scroll down over here and we go to our dolly, we can take a look at our dolly camera here. And if we go to the other side, look how pretty flat that is. Let's again turn off our kickers. And that's a lot moodier, a lot just more interesting. And even if we play back our dolly shot, let's see how our flares and our blooms are all working together. And that's, it's feeling pretty great right there. Like there's moments in there that feel really cinematic in that shot. And notice how by turning off the kickers, how much more interesting that shot became as far as lighting goes. Again, it's not a lighting class, but just wanted to demo that, especially in this part of the shot. Because check this out. There's a kicker back here, an edge light that's going to make him really flat. And that's just not interesting. Not interesting here. And it's certainly not interesting here because we're just seeing way too much. We're feeling that light on him. So I'm going to turn that off again. Yeah, there's moments in here that look really, really great right in that region there. And so there you have it. I think overall, we've done a really good job with our post-process volume. I'm going to turn the kickers back on from this side now. And that looks better, obviously, for this side of the camera. But overall, I'd say we did a really good job with our post-process volume and kind of degrading the image and getting a more realistic feel to all of our shots in our scene in general. Life is imperfect, so we just added some small imperfections to mimic that.